December 1942, somewhere above the Solomon Islands. A sky that feels too wide, too empty, and yet alive with noise. The air trembles under the dull roar of engines. 4 Wright cyclones, pushing a B-17 through humid air thick enough to taste. Inside the belly of that flying fortress stands a boy, really 19-year-old Eddie Kowalski, waist gunner, face streaked with sweat and engine grease. His hands grip the handles of a Browning M2 like a lifeline. The vibration of the machine gun hums through his bones, rattling his ribs, his teeth, his thoughts. Out of the clouds, at his 10 o'clock, a flicker of movement, silver wings catching the sun, a Japanese Zero cutting across his field of vision, maybe 300 yards out, fast, smooth, graceful. It's there for only an instant, a dart of light slicing through the air. Eddie does what every instinct in his body tells him to do. He pulls the gun around, sights the fuselage, holds his breath, and presses the trigger. The Browning roars, spewing a stream of orange tracers that arc through the sky in perfect, deadly geometry, except every single round sails harmlessly behind the Zero. The enemy pilot doesn't flinch, doesn't even bother to roll or dive. He just glides away untouched, shrinking into the horizon like a ghost. Eddie stares after him, disbelieving. His ammunition counter spins towards 0, the smell of burnt powder thick in his nose. It feels personal, like failure. But it isn't. Not his, anyway. This same moment was repeating itself across the skies of Europe and the Pacific, over France, over Burma, over the endless sea. Thousands of American gunners, trained to perfection, fueled by fear and duty, armed with the finest weapons their nation could forge, were missing, again and again, not occasionally, constantly. When the Army Air Forces studied gun camera footage from bomber missions in early 1943, the results were devastating. Hit rates against crossing targets were under 4%. 4. For every 100 rounds fired, 96 hit nothing but sky. The math was merciless. A fighter might be visible for 10 seconds, maybe 12, before it flashed out of range or behind a cloud. The M2 fired 13 rounds per second. In that short window, a gunner could fire 130 rounds, and maybe, if he was lucky, 5 would connect. 5 rounds against an aircraft built to take dozens. A Zero could shrug them off. A Focke-Wulf 190 could laugh at them. The numbers weren't abstract. Every month, the 8th Air Force lost nearly 200 bombers over Europe. Each one carried 10 men. That's almost 2,000 crewmen gone, dead, captured, or vanished into clouds of smoke and sea spray, every 30 days. Behind each statistic was a name, a face, a mother's letter folded in a breast pocket. And often, the reason was brutally simple. They couldn't hit back. The gunners were brave, skilled, disciplined. But physics didn't care about bravery. See, every gunner did the same thing. You aim at what you see. You point the crosshairs, you pull the trigger, the thing gets hit. That's how the world works when you're shooting at a still target or a running deer. But in the air, against a target crossing at 300 miles per hour, it's an illusion. The Zero isn't there when your bullet arrives. The air between you and it isn't empty. It's a gulf of time. The Browning's bullets fly at nearly 2,900 feet per second. Fast, sure, but not fast enough. At a range of 300 yards, that bullet takes roughly a third of a second to travel. In that same heartbeat, a Zero moving at 300 mph covers another 136 feet. By the time the bullet arrives, the target has long since moved on, untouched and unbothered. The result was what gunners called shooting ghosts. You fired at the plane you saw, but by the time the tracers reached that point in space, the plane was gone. What you saw wasn't what was. It was what had been. The phenomenon had a name: deflection error. Theoretical, mathematical, invisible. It was known to scientists long before the war, but that didn't help the kid with frostbitten fingers gripping a gun turret at 25,000 feet. Because knowing and doing, those are two different wars. The correction required to hit a crossing target wasn't small. It was immense, almost insane. You had to aim 15 to 20 feet ahead of the enemy's nose, aim at nothing, trust in math, and believe that your bullets in the enemy would meet somewhere in that invisible middle. Every instinct screamed against it. You could feel it in your gut. Pointing your gun at empty air while a fighter bore down on you felt like suicide. And most gunners, understandably, couldn't make themselves do it. Training programs tried. At Laredo and Harlingen, at Buckingham Field in Florida, trainees spent endless hours in classroom simulations. They studied lead angles, practiced on moving trucks, shooting at towed targets, even watched film loops that diagrammed how to walk bursts ahead of fast-moving planes. But when they got to combat, with wind howling through the turret, flak bursting outside, oxygen masks fogging, and the world spinning around them, all that geometry vanished. Instinct took over, and instinct told them to shoot straight. Deflection wasn't one problem, it was hundreds. Every shot depended on angle, speed, distance, altitude, and motion, not just of the enemy, but of your own plane. Was he climbing? Diving? Were you turning? The numbers shifted constantly, and you had seconds, 4, maybe 5, to figure it out while tracer rounds zipped past your canopy and your hands shook from adrenaline. Even if you understood the math, your body betrayed you. You aimed at the danger, not the empty space beside it. The gun camera footage told the same sad story over and over. At first, gunners tried to lead. You could see the tracers streaking ahead of the target, but after missing, they'd adjust back, closing the gap until they were shooting directly at the plane again, and missing again. The irony was cruel. They were correcting themselves in the wrong direction, trusting their eyes instead of physics. And as the bombs fell on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the cost of that invisible error mounted. In October 1943, 291 B-17s went out. 60 never came home. The survivors limped back with holes in their wings, blood in the walkways, engines coughing smoke across the English sky. When the crews climbed out, the debriefings were quiet. The gunners said the same thing again and again. We fired, we saw the tracers, but they just kept coming. Something fundamental had to change. And fast, because at those loss rates, the Allied bombing campaign would bleed out before it ever reached Berlin. The answer, strangely enough, had already been written, 19 years earlier, by a man almost no one remembered. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, not the inventor of the 18th century defense gun, but a quiet artillery officer who loved numbers and saw war through the lens of physics. Back in 1924, he'd written a technical paper called The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery, tucked away in a filing cabinet at the Field Artillery School, gathering dust. At the time, few cared. Air combat was still new then, romantic, reckless, almost poetic. The idea that hitting a moving target would one day require more math than courage seemed absurd. But by 1943, with bombers falling in waves and young men like Eddie Kowalski learning the hard way that valor couldn't bend time, Puckle's equations suddenly mattered. They weren't abstract anymore. They were survival. That's how war often works. The past whispers the answer, and only when enough lives are lost do we start listening. Somewhere over the Pacific, the B-17's engines drone steady again. Eddie wipes sweat from his brow and reloads. The sun dips low, bleeding through clouds like molten glass. In the faint hum of the gun barrels cooling, you can almost hear it. The quiet between battles, where understanding begins to form. A silence heavy enough to change everything. Puckle wasn't a man of theories alone. He was a soldier who had seen what war could do to both men and machines. In France, during the final years of the Great War, he had watched the first fragile biplanes twist through the clouds like moths drawn toward a flame, their machine guns sputtering uncertainly in duels that were more poetry than science. Yet even then, standing in the mud and chaos below, he had seen what few others noticed, that aviation, still young and awkward, was racing toward speeds that would soon break the human ability to aim. Traditional marksmanship, with its steady breathing and gentle squeeze of the trigger, belonged to another century. His 1924 paper, The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery, was written in that quiet between wars when most of the world wanted to forget about the last one. Puckle laid out his mathematics with the kind of cold precision only a man who had seen blood could muster. He demonstrated that as aircraft speeds surpassed 150 miles per hour, the required lead angles grew so large, so unnatural, that no amount of training could overcome human instinct. Against a target moving at 250 miles per hour, crossing at a perfect right angle, the gunner would have to aim 4, sometimes 5 plane lengths ahead, at what looked like nothing at all. His tables were filled with numbers that defied logic. A 200-yard shot at 90 degrees against a 300-pound target required 47 feet of lead, double the range, and the lead doubled too, nearly 100 feet of empty sky. It was all there in black ink, the geometry of failure. And his conclusion was merciless. Without mechanical assistance, without some new way of thinking, aerial gunners would be obsolete within a decade. The Army filed his paper away, a footnote to a future no one believed in, and went on teaching men to shoot like it was still 1918. Through the 1920s and 30s, aircraft evolved faster than anyone could have imagined. Metal replaced canvas, engines doubled and tripled in power, and what had once been dogfights between fragile wings became high-speed duels in 3 dimensions. But gunnery training remained a relic. Instructors spoke of sight pictures and breath control, of squeezing, not jerking, the trigger, as if their students were still aiming at paper targets across a field. A handful of voices, quiet, nervous, warned that speed was about to change everything. They were dismissed. After all, Americans had always been good shots. From the frontier to the Argonne, from Daniel Boone to Sergeant York, the myth of the natural marksman ran deep. When the United States entered World War II, that myth collapsed under the cold mechanics of modern combat. In 1942, the Army Air Force's gunnery course lasted 4 weeks. 4. Recruits fired barely 1,000 rounds in total, most of them at slow, towed sleeves that drifted lazily across the sky like parade targets. Not a single scenario resembled the chaos of a Focke-Wulf 190 diving through a bomber formation at $400 MEPS, or a 0 flashing across a gunner's window in a single, heart-stopping instant. Graduates earned their wings, climbed aboard B-17s and B-24s, and discovered too late that they had been trained for a world that no longer existed. By mid-1942, with bomber losses mounting and morale cracking, desperation drove a few officers back into forgotten archives. One of them, Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Analysis Section, stumbled across Puckle's long-buried report at right field. He read it in one sitting, his eyes moving faster with each page, until he underlined 2 words 3 times. He knew. The old artillerymen had seen the future and been ignored. 18 years before the first B-17 ever crossed the channel, Puckle had predicted this disaster. His math hadn't changed, because physics doesn't age. What changed were the names of the men dying beneath it. The tragedy wasn't in the equations, it was in the silence that followed them. But the question now wasn't whether Puckle had been right. That was beyond dispute. The question was whether anyone could still fix it. You couldn't teach a gunner to calculate deflection while under attack. No one could solve trigonometry at 300 miles while tracer fire stitched the air around them. The human brain simply couldn't move that fast. So maybe the answer wasn't more math. Maybe it was less. Across the Atlantic, the British had already stumbled towards that revelation, born, as most breakthroughs are, out of desperation. In the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe's Blitzkrieg thundered over the English Channel, RAF pilots faced their own reckoning. Squadron 609, based at Middle Wallop, flew the legendary Spitfire, a sleek machine of grace and speed. Yet their bullets were failing to meet their mark. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July engagements and found the truth almost unbearable. His squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitt BF-109s was around 6%. 6 hits in every 100 rounds fired. The Spitfire's ammunition load lasted 16 seconds at full fire, a quarter of a minute of metallic fury. Pilots were burning through their entire belts, watching German fighters spiral home untouched. Their commander, Squadron Leader Horace "Horry" Darley, decided something had to change, even if it broke every rule in the RAF handbook. Darley was no ordinary officer. Before the war, he'd been a champion clay pigeon shooter, a sport where instinct, not calculation, ruled. He understood something that theorists had missed. The best shooters didn't think about lead. They felt it. Their bodies, through repetition, learned the rhythm of motion. The eyes watched, the hands adjusted, and the mind stayed quiet. So in early August 1940, in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every available plane was needed in the air, Darley did something unthinkable. He grounded his entire squadron. 3 days. No patrols, no sorties, just experiments. He had a Hurricane tow a target banner across the gunnery range while his pilots took turns firing at it. But he changed one rule, the rule that every gunner had been taught from the first day of training. Don't aim, he told them. Don't calculate. Just move with it. Fire while you're still turning. The instructions sounded like madness. Every pilot hesitated, their instincts rebelling against it. But Darley insisted. Trust your motion, he said. Your hands will find it before your head does. The first runs were humiliating. Bullets stitched harmless lines across the empty sky, missing by 40-50 feet. But Darley made them try again and again. 40 passes each, over 3 relentless days. No diagrams, no lectures on trajectory, just repetition and the slow rewiring of instinct. Fire while the world is still moving. Don't wait for the stillness that never comes. By the 3rd day, something subtle began to happen. The tracers started meeting the target. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. 6% became 12, maybe 15. Small numbers, but in war, small numbers mean lives. Double the hits meant twice the chance of crippling an enemy plane, twice the chance of surviving the next engagement. Darley's report, submitted to Fighter Command on August 18, 1940, was brief but revolutionary. He noted that the pilots who improved fastest weren't the sharpshooters. They were the ones who had let go, who had stopped trying to think their way through the battle. They trusted the strange, quiet calculations of the subconscious, that part of the mind honed by rhythm and motion, like a baseball player catching a fly ball by instinct alone. The conscious brain, Darley wrote, was simply too slow for air combat. Victory depended on training the subconscious, not to analyze, but to feel, to make the impossible math disappear into muscle memory. Fighter Command circulated Darley's findings, but adoption was uneven. Some squadrons embraced the technique, retraining their pilots in this new, instinctive shooting style. Others dismissed it outright, calling it unscientific, reckless, even dangerous. Many instructors, veterans of the last war, refused to believe that everything they'd been teaching for 20 years might now be useless. But numbers have no politics, and combat, brutal, impartial combat, kept proving Darley right. On a summer morning not long after, a Spitfire pilot from another squadron banked through cloud over the channel, sunlight glinting off his canopy. A BF-109 flashed across his nose, low and fast. Without thinking, without aiming, his hands moved, the guns roared, and for the first time, the tracers met something solid. The German plane burst into smoke and fell, spiraling into the sea below. That was the moment instinct beat mathematics. The moment when war taught men once again that survival often belongs not to the cleverest, but to those who can feel the rhythm of chaos and move before thought can catch up. And far away in a dusty American archive, Puckle's paper sat underlined on a captain's desk, its words quietly echoing across two oceans, a voice from another war whispering, "I told you this would happen." By the autumn of 1940, something subtle yet undeniable was shifting in the air war above Europe. Squadrons that had embraced the unorthodox technique of motion-based deflection shooting, that strange new art of feeling the lead instead of calculating it, began to show clear, measurable improvements. Their kill ratios rose, quietly but steadily, enough that even the most skeptical commanders took notice. By early 1941, the technique had slipped into everyday use across the RAF, unacknowledged in official manuals, but practiced faithfully in the cockpit, a whispered secret among those who'd seen it work. American observers stationed in Britain, sent to learn what they could from the ongoing battle, took careful notes. They watched these British pilots, their movements fluid and instinctive, hitting targets that logic said they shouldn't be able to. But the United States Army Air Forces faced a dilemma of a different kind. Fighter pilots could learn deflection through practice and repetition, by trusting motion, by letting the aircraft's turn do the math for them. But the men in bombers, those young gunners standing in the cold bellies of B-17s and B-24s, had no such advantage. Their aircraft didn't dance, it lumbered, straight and level, heavy and slow. They couldn't roll into a turn to generate natural lead. They had no control over their vector or speed, only their hands gripping the handles of twin Brownings and their eyes trying to track a darting shadow through the gun sight glass. The bomber's body shook under flak bursts, the smell of cordite mixed with oxygen and fear, and still they aimed straight at what they saw, because that's all they could do. If instinct couldn't help them, and conscious calculation was too slow, the answer would have to come from somewhere else, from machinery, not muscle. And so, in early 1942, a quiet division at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology began work on a device that would change aerial combat forever. Its name was deliberately misleading: the Radiation Laboratory. To anyone outside, it sounded like secret atomic research, a convenient smokescreen for what Division 7 was actually building: fire control systems. At its helm stood Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a man of methodical brilliance, just over 40, with the kind of calm focus that could turn chaos into geometry. For a decade, he'd been designing gyroscopic instruments to keep aircraft steady and true across long distances. Draper understood something fundamental that few others grasped. This wasn't really a problem of shooting. It was a problem of prediction. The key was not to tell the gunner where the target was, but where it would be by the time the bullets arrived. By the summer of 1943, his team had something astonishing: a prototype called the Mark 14 computing gun sight. To the untrained eye, it looked like something from another world. A polished metal assembly weighing nearly 30 pounds, laced with wires, gears, and a glowing optical lens that seemed to float in mid-air. It drew power from the aircraft's generator, the gyroscopes humming quietly, like the heartbeat of a machine that could think. The principle was deceptively simple. The gunner adjusted a small dial, matching a set of reference marks to the enemy aircraft's wingspan. This told the system how far away the target was. Then, for just 2 seconds, he tracked the plane smoothly across his viewfinder. During those seconds, the gyroscope inside the sight measured angular velocity, how fast the target was moving across the gunner's line of vision. Hidden beneath the casing, a network of cams, gears, and linkages, a true analog computer, began its silent calculations. It combined the measured speed, the range, and the known ballistic behavior of a 50 caliber round, solving an equation that would take a man several minutes to work through on paper, but doing it 30 times a second. And then, like magic, it projected the result into the gunner's eye, a glowing dot floating ahead of the enemy aircraft. That dot was not where the plane was. It was where it would be. All the gunner had to do was trust it. The effect was transformative. In tests conducted at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, during the late summer of 1943, gunners who had previously hit just 4 or 5 targets out of every 100 suddenly jumped to 18. After a week's practice, that figure climbed to 25. The Mark 14 didn't make them braver or more skilled. It simply gave their instincts the one thing they'd been missing: the truth of physics in real time. It was like giving sight to the blind. But progress in war is never as fast as the need for it. The Allies had the design, the data, and the miracle device, but not the time. Manufacturing something so precise and the quantities required would take months, perhaps years. Each gun sight had to be machined to perfection, calibrated by hand, and then installed in bombers already being pushed off the assembly lines by the thousands. By early 1944, new aircraft were rolling out with the Mark 14 installed, but tens of thousands of older planes were still flying with simple iron sights, glass, wire, and guesswork. Those gunners needed help now, and the help, when it finally came, didn't come from scientists or officers, but from the gunners themselves. From the men who stood in those vibrating fuselages, who had seen tracer fire carve through the sky and lived to tell about it. It came from the Pacific, where the sun burned brighter, the visibility stretched for miles, and the air battles unfolded in vast, open skies unclouded by European weather. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming was one of them. A waist gunner aboard the USS Lexington's Air Group, he had survived 31 combat missions by the spring of 1944. 4 times, his aircraft had been shot down beneath him. He wasn't an engineer, He wasn't even an officer, but he had something no scientist did: 40,000 rounds of lived experience and a notebook filled with sketches and scars. In that notebook, between smudges of graphite and sweat, were hand-drawn outlines of enemy aircraft. From each nose, lines extended forward, one plane length, two, sometimes three. Notes scribbled beside them: hit here, 2 lengths ahead. Fleming had measured these leads in the only units that mattered to him: the shapes he'd seen through his gun sight, the silhouettes burned into memory. During a debriefing on March 14, 1944, he showed his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's sharpest tactical minds. O'Hare studied the crude sketches, the field notes of a man who had learned through fire and instinct what others had failed to teach through theory. He saw not doodles, but data, real-world deflection information gathered under the worst possible conditions: combat. O'Hare ordered Fleming to train every gunner aboard the Lexington in his method, not in classrooms, on deck. The exercise was simple but ingenious. Fleming had another sailor hold a model aircraft mounted on a long pole. As the model flew past at different angles, the gunners aimed their unloaded weapons, extending their aim point ahead of the nose: 1 aircraft length for a shallow crossing, 2 for a medium pass, 3 or more for steep angles. He taught them to see in those measurements, to judge lead not in feet or degrees, but in the living language of combat, the size of the enemy in their sights. At first, the Lexington's gunnery officer dismissed it as nonsense, but the fleet was bleeding, and skepticism was a luxury no one could afford. He approved a test during operations near Truk Lagoon in March 1944. For 8 weeks, he tracked every engagement: ammunition used, hits confirmed, losses sustained. Then, Fleming's training began. The numbers that followed were undeniable. Before Fleming's instruction, the gunners averaged just over 4 hits per 100 rounds fired. 6 weeks later, that number had climbed to 9, more than double. The same guns, the same aircraft, the same men, only now armed with understanding. Word spread like wildfire. By May, the Essex, the Enterprise, and the Bunker Hill had all adopted versions of the spot shooting method. Each carrier modified it slightly, refining the system. But the core remained pure. No equations, no instruments, just a simple human scale of vision and motion. Count the lengths, trust the rhythm, fire ahead of what you see, and it worked. For the first time, gunners were fighting on equal terms with physics, not against it. It's easy now to think of war as machinery and math, as factories, engines, and logistics charts. But in those days, victory often hinged on moments like this, when one man with a notebook and a few lines of pencil could change the odds for thousands. Fleming didn't know it then, but his sketches would echo far beyond the decks of the Lexington. They would ripple through the entire Pacific Fleet, saving lives he'd never meet, turning panic into precision. And on quiet nights between missions, when the engines idled and the ocean wind drifted through the open gun ports, you could imagine him looking down at those same hand-drawn lines, the pencil marks faint from sweat and oil, whispering the same words he'd taught 100 others. Don't aim where he is, aim where he's going. Somewhere out there, under the vast Pacific sky, tracers arced forward, no longer chasing shadows, but meeting them. 3 seconds. That was all the time a .50 caliber bullet needed to cross the sky between life and death. 3 seconds of flight. 3 seconds that decided whether a zero fell from the heavens or kept on slicing through blue air untouched. For the gunners who learned it, those 3 seconds became something like prayer, a rhythm, a truth they carried in their muscles rather than their minds. The rule was simple enough to sound like superstition. Lead by 3 plane lengths on a crossing shot. Yet behind that simplicity lay one of the great rediscoveries of the war, how the human brain truly sees. See, our eyes are remarkable things, but they lie to us. They're masters of comparison, hopeless with absolutes. Ask a man to imagine 50 feet at 300 yards and he'll guess wildly. But tell him to lead his fire by 2 plane lengths, and he knows. The aircraft itself becomes the ruler, its silver body stretched across the mind's eye as a measuring stick for death and survival. That's why Fleming's field-borne spot shooting method spread so fast. It matched how people really perceive, not how they thought they should. By mid-1944, even the U.S. Army Air Forces had caught up. They called their version radius of action shooting. Technical manuals, once dense with equations and ballistic charts, now carried illustrations, silhouettes of enemy fighters with little dotted lines ahead of their noses, each labeled in simple multiples: 1 wingspan, 2 fuselage lengths, 3. The gunnery school at Lavenham, England, tore up its old program and rebuilt everything from scratch that June. And slowly, painfully, the statistics began to shift. Loss rates started to fall. In October of 43, 5 out of every 100 bombers sent over Germany never came back. By July 44, that number had dropped to 3.5. It might not sound like much, but those percentages meant hundreds of fathers, brothers, sons who came home instead of vanishing into smoke. Still, knowing how to do something and being able to do it under fire are 2 very different things. The Air Force psychologists who studied returning gunners in 1944 began to understand that difference intimately. It wasn't ignorance that doomed them. It was instinct. Men could recite every lead distance, every rule, every procedure perfectly in calm conversation. But the moment an enemy fighter appeared, diving through the formation with its guns flashing, all that knowledge melted away. One psychologist, Captain Harold, Clean, stationed at Bovington, called it threat fixation collapse. He'd watch gun camera film frame by frame and pair it with post-mission interviews. What he saw was heartbreakingly human. Gunners would begin their engagement correctly, aiming ahead of the enemy, firing with proper deflection. But as that sleek, dark shape grew larger in the glass, their minds betrayed them. Fear whispered louder than training. Their crosshairs slid backward toward the threat itself, until they were shooting straight at the danger they so desperately wanted to stop. It happened fastest during head-on attacks, when the closing speed between bomber and fighter topped 500 miles an hour. 2 seconds. That was all the time a man had before impact. 2 seconds to steady his breath, override instinct, and let logic win over panic. And most couldn't. Under that pressure, the mind reverted to its oldest command: point at what's coming to kill you. The only cure was repetition. Endless, grinding repetition, until the deflection shot became something deeper than thought. It had to live in the body itself, buried in muscle memory like walking, like catching a baseball, something done without permission from the conscious mind. But that kind of training demanded time and ammunition, and in the desperate years of 1942 and 1943, the military had neither. By late 1944, though, the tide had shifted. Allied air superiority was improving, training bases were better staffed, and for the first time, there was a sliver of breathing room. The gunnery schools extended their programs. 4 weeks became 8, then 10. Students no longer fired a mere 1,000 rounds. They burned through 5,000 before earning their wings. Half of those rounds were spent shooting at moving targets, the simulated real combat speeds. The Navy's Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, Florida, built what was, for its time, an astonishingly advanced setup. They mounted 50 caliber turrets on motorized platforms that could pivot and elevate, mimicking the motion of airborne combat. Out over the water, high-speed boats towed targets at 60 miles per hour, darting unpredictably across the horizon. The wind off the Atlantic carried the crack of gunfire for miles. Each trainee would take 50 to 70 passes a day, hour after hour, until the smell of gun oil and salt water fused into memory. Instructors rarely spoke during these drills. No shouting, no corrections mid-burst, just the sound of the gun, the sting of recoil, and the sight of tracer rounds arcing against the sun. They wanted the students to feel their misses and learn through the feedback loop nature had designed. See, adjust, fire again. It was learning by rhythm, not reason. And for the best of them, something remarkable began to happen. Combat footage from the final year of the war shows it clearly. The elite gunners, the men who had survived 30 missions or more, displayed an eerie steadiness even under chaos. In the film, you can almost see the pattern. Enemy fighters diving in, cannon flashes strobing through the smoke, the bombers buffeted by flak. And yet those gunners held their lead, kept their aim fixed just ahead of where the enemy would be. Their tracers didn't chase. They waited. They led. Many of these veterans later admitted they'd felt certain they were about to die. Their hearts were pounding, their breath shallow, but their hands stayed steady, almost detached, moving with a kind of grace that came from somewhere beyond thought. The Japanese called it mushin, the no-mind state. Martial artists achieve it after years of practice, when action flows directly from the body without interference from fear or hesitation. In those frozen seconds, surrounded by sound and light, the gunners reached that same state. But such mastery came at a cost. It took thousands of rounds, weeks of training, and a kind of mental endurance that few men could maintain. The war demanded 50,000 new gunners in 6 months. There was no time to craft each into an expert. The math was merciless. When experience costs 10 weeks and lives are lost daily, compromise becomes policy. Most of the young men who climbed into B-17s never reached true unconscious competence. They lived instead in the uneasy middle, good enough when there was time to think, too fragile when there wasn't. Their training was sound, their courage unquestioned, but under sudden attack, instinct too often won. That unevenness created a hidden hierarchy in the sky. Not all bombers were equal, not even within the same formation. Some had veterans manning the guns, men whose instincts had hardened into precision. Others carried rookies barely out of training, whose first experience with real combat was also their last. The difference showed. German fighter pilots learned to see it almost instantly. They could read a formation like a living thing, sensing where its defenses were strong and where they were uncertain. Hesitant fire gave them an opening, a window of weakness amid the thunder of machine guns. They would dart in where the tracers wavered, avoid the places where they came thick and steady. It was a deadly conversation, carried out in light and motion at hundreds of miles per hour. And so the revolution in deflection shooting, the one that began with British clay pigeons and an American engineer's forgotten paper, didn't truly end when the guns fell silent in 1945. Its echo carried forward into every weapon that followed. The lesson was universal. You never aim where the target is. You aim where it will be. The Mark 14 gun sight evolved after the war, becoming the Mark 18, lighter, faster, more reliable. And it served again in Korea, still doing the same work, turning instinct into precision. Then came digital fire control computers, calculating lead angles and trajectories with electric pulse, instead of polished brass gears. By Vietnam, fighter jets carried radar-assisted gun systems that performed in microseconds what Draper's mechanical gyroscopes had once done 30 times a second. The F-4 Phantom's optical sight, a descendant of those early experiments, did all the math invisibly. Pilots didn't need to think in angles or seconds anymore. They simply kept their targets inside a glowing frame, and the machine handled the rest. Today, air combat has evolved beyond gunfire entirely. Missiles lead by miles instead of feet. Yet the physics remain unchanged. A modern AMRAAM, guided by inertial navigation and radar, continuously recalculates its path, predicting where its target will be thousands of times per second. The same problem Fleming once solved with a pencil and a notebook aboard the Lexington. Even the F-22 Raptor, bristling with technology, lives by that same truth. Its AN/APG-77 radar doesn't just track, it anticipates, projecting enemy motion forward, adjusting its weapons and course before the pilot even feels the need to act. All of it, the silicon, the sensors, the code, is built on a single idea, first scratched onto paper in 1944 by a man who'd counted 3 plane lengths in the Pacific Sun. And even now, in Top Gun classrooms, where the next generation of aviators trains, the fundamentals haven't vanished. Among all the complex systems and heads-up displays, instructors still teach the oldest lesson: how to lead with the gun, how to predict motion, how to trust your eyes less and your timing more. Because sometimes, when technology fails and distance closes fast, it's still down to one pilot, one heartbeat, and the invisible line between instinct and precision. Out there, above the clouds, the echoes of those lessons remain, drifting through time like contrails fading into dusk. Even today, long after the roar of piston engines faded into memory, pilots still learn to aim ahead of what they see. Not because they expect to dogfight with cannons anymore, but because mastering that counterintuitive motion, predicting where a moving target will be rather than where it is, sharpens something far deeper than aim. It teaches a kind of instinctive geometry, an understanding of time, motion, and consequence. A pilot who's mastered deflection shooting doesn't just shoot better, he sees better. He reads the sky differently, senses closing speed, feels the shift of angles in his bones. Whether firing a cannon or lining up a missile shot, the logic remains the same. You move not toward what is, but toward what will be. That understanding, first born in the chaos of 1943, now lives quietly inside every part of modern aviation. From fighter jets streaking through stratospheric air to naval CIWS turrets that guard steel decks at sea, they all follow the same truth that young gunners once struggled to grasp while sweat froze on their oxygen masks. Systems like the Phalanx CIWS, defending American destroyers, or the C-RAM protecting soldiers on the ground, are simply faster, smarter extensions of the same human lesson. They calculate lead, measure closure, and predict impact. Only now it's done with electrons instead of intuition. The Phalanx fires 4,500 rounds per minute, 75 a second, each one tracing the invisible mathematics of survival. Radar whirls, sensors hum, and inside that machine, equations unfold thousands of times a heartbeat. It does automatically what Eddie Kowalski once tried to do over the Solomon Islands, with his hands shaking around a Browning M2. Aim not at the danger itself, but at the air in front of it, trusting that the laws of motion would carry his bullets to the right place. Even in our digital age, the ghosts of those lessons live on, sometimes in unexpected places. The same principle that saved bombers now teaches teenagers through their computer screens. Combat simulators like War Thunder or Digital Combat Simulator build worlds where virtual pilots rediscover that timeless frustration. Your tracers arc beautifully, yet always behind the enemy. You miss. You adjust. You learn to aim ahead, to predict the dance of motion rather than react to it. It's history repeating itself, just without the smoke and fear. And, just like the gunners of 1943, the players who stay long enough begin to feel something change. Their hands start to move before their thoughts catch up. Their reflexes begin to outpace their reasoning. They stop thinking about lead and start feeling it. What was once calculation becomes intuition. That same fragile transformation from conscious effort to instinctive precision that once kept men alive in cold, thin air. Back then, this shift changed everything. When the first B-17 crews took off for Germany, they hit their targets only 4% of the time. By the end of 1944, that number had climbed past 20. The same guns, the same planes, the same men, but a new understanding. That jump in accuracy wasn't born from better machinery or superior numbers. It came from something more profound, finally teaching the human mind to work with physics instead of against it, because that was the real war inside the war, not just between nations, but between instinct and reason. The hardest battle was convincing men to ignore what felt right, to pull the trigger while aiming at empty sky, to trust that what seemed like madness was, in truth, mathematics. It went against every fiber of what it meant to be human, the ancient reflex to fix your eyes on danger and confront it directly. But those who learned to resist that reflex, who trained their bodies to act on calculation rather than fear, discovered something powerful, that instincts could be rewritten. They proved that human nature is not fixed, that courage isn't just facing what you see, but believing in what you can't. Thousands of airmen who might have died instead came home. Enemy. Aircraft that once slipped away in silence now fell burning through the clouds. The bombing campaigns that teetered on failure finally reached their marks. All of it, the victories, the survivals, the turning of the tide, came from one simple, almost absurd idea, that survival depended on trusting the invisible. And perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of those skybound men. They taught us that our instincts, however ancient, can betray us, but our minds can learn. That if we study carefully, train relentlessly, and dare to trust reason over reflex, we can reshape our very nature. The lesson didn't stay in the skies. It found its way into every discipline where motion, risk, and timing collide, from modern warfare to engineering, from sports to spaceflight. In every field where a human being faces uncertainty, where action must anticipate consequence, the wisdom of those gunners still whispers through time. Aim not where it is, but where it's going to be. It's a strange comfort, really, to think that such a hard-earned truth, born amid flak bursts and fear, still lives quietly inside our machines, our training, our games, even our metaphors for life itself. We're not prisoners of instinct. We can adapt, even under pressure, even when everything inside us says otherwise. That lesson, forged over Europe, tested over the Pacific, and passed down through circuits, screens, and generations, remains as true now as it was then. Somewhere, in the steady hum of a ship's CIWS system, or the faint click of a flight simulator's joystick, you can still feel it, that invisible thread connecting a young gunner's trembling hands to the calm precision of the modern age. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the rhythm of engines and code, you might just hear it again, the sound of bullets meeting the future